And we're on.
Good afternoon, or good morning and good afternoon for everyone that's joining the second I&I webinar today. We have two guests, myself and also the regular, one of the regular hosts as well, David Bovis, who are online today. And we're going to be covering the topic of what are the challenges driving operational excellence in a regulated industry. On the panel, I want to make some short introductions to everyone. Firstly, Mark Parsons. Mark joins us. He's based in New York currently, or up in Connecticut, currently with Barclays Bank. And Mark has a background, 25 plus years in banking industry and driving large-scale strategic change and operational excellence within a number of different environments and also a number of different companies. So currently with Barclays, leading their lean and automation program. Mark, prior to that and relevant to this conversation, I'm sure, led the regulatory change initiative for the investment bank at Barclays. And prior to that, a couple of stints at Credit Suisse in Singapore and in Asia and in the US as well. And then also at HSBC, where he was in the UK and also in Canada. Mark's a member of the Institute of Bankers and he's a certified MBB. So thanks, Mark, for joining. I'm glad to say Angel Garcia has joined us from a hotel room in Chicago.
Yes, sir.
Thanks for joining us, Angel. You were right on time. Delayed on a flight this morning coming into Chicago, but Angel's currently with Catalent Pharma. He's the global head of CI at Catalent. He has a 20 plus year career in change, OPEX, supply chain management and commercial operations. He was actually leading before Catalent the operational excellence program for the #1 Hispanic television broadcaster, Univision. And then prior to that, a long history and career in pharmaceuticals with a number of pharma companies, Cordis, which is a J&J business, Covidien, which is medical devices, and Medtronic as well. So a lot of relevant information I'm sure Angel will bring to the show. And then last but not least, we've got Dale Easdon on the panel as a guest. Dale joins us currently in Texas, where he's the COO for Snap Kitchen. Many of you will know Snap Kitchen if you're based in the US, but they're a healthy food alternative to the fast food market. Very, very good products. Dale is the COO. He's a business transformation executive and a process improvement leader. Prior to his current role, he led the turnaround of of Taylor Farms, which is they describe themselves as being based in the salad bowl of America. So they produce lettuce and green products for many of the products that we see today on our shelves. And then prior to that, a career in the airline catering industry, LSG Sky Chefs. Many of you will eat and dine on their food on a regular basis if you get on a flight. And also 9 years running the food services division for Continental. And then David Bovis is also here as well, although he's dropped off. So I'm hoping he's going to come back on. David's a regular on the show. He's the MD of Ducks in a Row. He's an independent consultant based in the UK. He's got about 20 years leading change in large organizations. He also has a background and a professional study and an educational study in psychology and neuroscience. So he'll bring that kind of change concept from that angle. I want to start by welcoming everyone. Thanks for everyone joining. We've got some latecomers, but we've got a good group of people already live. We're tweeting out here on with the hashtag the I&I show, and I would hope that everyone can join the room and ask some questions. There's a chat bar on everyone's right-hand side of the screen. So any questions from any of the viewing membership, if you want to ask a question to one of the panel or a regular question to all of us here, I'll try and field those questions out to the panel as and when they come in. But we'll start. I want to open up, and I want to get a view from probably Mark first, actually. Talk about your industry, Mark. Talk about operational excellence and particularly as it relates to regulation in the finance industry from your experience.
Sure. Thank you, David. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. And David, thank you for that very complimentary intro. I feel a lot better now. Thank you for that. I've had about 8 or 9 days to prepare for this session, so I thought, I'd have it, pretty much done and dusted. And then as soon as I started going through and looking at my own experiences, I realised that there's a lot of challenge out there. But if I can, I want to reference a conversation I had last Wednesday with the Fed examiner in Barclays. Most of the banks have on-site resident examination teams, and I'll talk more about that later on if I get a chance. But I listened to this lady for about 8-9 minutes, and I asked her quite simply what she wanted from banking, what she wanted from the industry. And I sadly need glasses to read this, but here's some words that I wanted to share that may resonate with us as a community. So what she is looking for, particularly in Barclays, is consistency, repetition, in control, and to be able to demonstrate in control, stability, for processes to be effective, for processes to be efficient, and also to have a feedback loop, the ability to learn from our process and put that back into that process. And it struck me that we tend to view compliance and regulatory demands, maybe in an onerous way. But here we have a person representing FINRA in this case, looking for a process to transform, to change, to address those words that we've used for 10, 20, 30 years when we talk about Lean Sigma or Six Sigma or continuous improvement. So I just wanted to share that. That was last week from a Fed examiner looking for banks to change and become consistent and repetitive and transparent and stable. Just an interesting takeaway that I wanted to share with you all. And I think we all have the same views and we all have the same aims here, irrespective of the lens that we come from. I don't know long, David, I have to talk as part of this opening, but if you want me to shut up at some point, just raise your hand and I'll pass it over. But several things to talk about. One is the sheer weight of regulation. It's been unbelievable for 10 years in terms of what we've had to deal with and what we are dealing with. The other thing that's really missed, and I think it's very, very key, is the behavior of the regulator themselves. They've gone, if I can use a canine analogy, they've gone from being watchdogs to being more bloodhound. And I don't mean that in a negative way. They've been much more about how we do things. They're coming in and looking at our front to back process. They're looking at how we build value across our process. So it's not just what we produce at the end of it, it's actually how we are producing it. It's almost as important. So the regulators have been different and have been much more assertive and much more in our face in terms of how we look at implementing a change or a regulatory oversight. The banks are being decentralized, they're shrinking. All 3 banks that I know very, very well and others are having to change their footprint. They're becoming more regionalized. Structural reform, IHC here in the US, has become a massive challenge. And that's changing the way the banks are working and are structured. Global initiatives are happening less and less. We're much more regional in our outlook. And that's also asking us as a community to change. People, be they sponsors or budget owners, are scared, they're worried, they're tired, it's been churned, they've been cut to the bone. And that, again, gives me a challenge in the sense of appetite for change is not there. Simply put, people have been tired for a long time. Capacity is not there. Opportunity cost is not there. We are simply dealing with a workforce that are scared and tired. And if I think of us as a community, just one key message I want to take, and hopefully I can elaborate more. I think we've done a poor job, at least I think I have done a poor job, of linking continuous improvement to regulatory improvement or regulatory change. I think people still, when I go and introduce myself and explain what I do, they tend to think of it as a quality thing or as a cost thing or as a speed thing. And what I need to keep impressing upon people actually is continuous improvement and OPEX fundamentally can introduce and drive compliance and rigor and a much more regulated process. And I need to do a better job of linking CI, in my case, with a regulatory change. And we haven't done a good enough job of that. And one final thing before I stop, I know I have tried time and time again to get my foot in the door, and this is a massive opportunity for us to get our foot in the door. How we get in, it can be a whole range of avenues, but once we're in, we then can use our skills and our techniques and our approaches to drive change. And I think if we embraced regulatory change and regulatory compliance in a positive way and use it as an opportunity to get in and look at how we can build things, we would be a lot better. I think so far, certainly in my experience, we've tended to resist and view these demands as very onerous, things that have to be done, necessarily evil, non-value add, whatever you want to call it. But I think if we look at it and look at it as an opportunity to change, we would be better off. So I'm going to stop there, David, and apologies if I've overrun a bit.
Great. No, that's good, because I think when we start talking about regulators, it'll be interesting to get, because we're dealing with different regulators, right? So financial services regulators, and David Bovis has some experience with the FCA, which I'll ask him to bring up in a minute. Dale, let me come to you. Talk about the food industry and particularly, your experiences over the 20 plus years in both airline catering, but also now more recently in the fresh space.
Okay, thank you, David, and good morning and good afternoon to my friends in London. Go back a little bit to Snap Kitchen. Literally, we actually perform in 3 separate streams. There is our retail, which is the stores. We have digital, and then we have wholesale. So you'll see us in certain stores such as Whole Foods, for example. So 3 different streams, and we are governed at the production locations, which we call CPUs, Central Production Units, by the FDA, local city in each city we're in, local government, and the main one being USDA. So we have to be USDA compliant to put our meals into the wholesale arena, which really sets a very, very high standard and criteria of governance. Predominantly, the main focus for us is how do we replicate great design that our development chefs do. And these meals are restaurant standard. This is not your typical, a lot of people think of healthy meals, they think of diet. That's not what we do. We literally are making restaurant standard, beautiful, healthy meals with excellent chefs. But how do you replicate that in scale? So from design into 5,000 meals of each type in manufacturing whilst following compliance. And to do that, we follow lean principles. We literally are big believers in operational excellence. And we have lean leaders that not only look at productivity, quality, replication of standards, but at the same time, also making sure that we follow compliance. So a good example is 85% of all recalls in the wholesale and food division of the US under the USDA is due to labeling issues. So if you just have one error in your label, you can actually create a recall. And once you've got recalls, then of course your brand's affected, and then you're hitting the press, it's registered in Washington, etc. So the main focus for us is literally teaching employees, and our employee force is a couple of dollars above minimum wage, working in 40 degrees in the cold environment. How do you keep them motivated, and how do you follow compliance? And we find that lean is a way to do it. Gold standards, great specifications, and continuous training.
Angel, over to you on that, because you can bring a different context and a different group of regulatory view from an OPEX perspective.
No, definitely. I was listening to my peers over here, and it's very interesting. Mark was saying something that is very interesting. Basically, when you hear any kind of company that they want to launch an operational excellence program into the regulatory environment that you are based on that, and they said, we want to go ahead and launch a program to cost out. And they start talking about how much money do you need to actually save. That's one of the biggest mistakes that we make when we launch a program. Because when you work in an environment like in medical device, in pharma, the first thing that comes into our mind is patient safety. Patient safety is about how do we make something that we know that is right for our patient, that is not going to hurt our patients. So whatever we do, whatever process improvement we implement, we have to come that first. And basically, you have to go ahead and at the same time, you have to have the FDA environment that is so strict that you cannot imagine how difficult it is to go ahead and make sure that you're in compliance. But now, the difficult part on this is that we are focusing more in go ahead and do, you know what, we're going to go ahead and make sure that we cover the process improvement. How do we make sure that we actually go ahead and instead of working in pieces of how to save money, let's make the process better. Let's focus on that patient safety so we can get better quality in our products. How do we reduce deviations in our process? And how can we make it more that we can actually increase the capacity of our process? That's something that is very, very important in the pharma and the healthcare environment that we're working right now. You know, we are trying to move away from that cost out environment, and we're focusing more in, let's focus and do things right the first time. Let's focus in getting the right process in place, and everything flows into that. And it took time to get there. It took really much time to do it. Good, excellent.
I think there's a few things that I wanted to pick out from that. Mark talked about consistency, control, and repetitiveness, and I think Dale, you also echoed some of those points as well. And I think the other piece is around, creating versus proactive versus reactive.
We lost David.
We lost Dave.
Sorry, guys, I dropped off there. Can you hear me?
Yes, you're back.
I had a reactive system. As we were talking about that from a post-regulatory change, and I think a lot of regulatory change, particularly when I think about financial services and what you've talked about there, Mark, is increasing regulatory requirements being brought down on businesses. So as it relates to operational excellence, let me ask this, how do you guys react to regulation? When you think about operational excellence, how does it marry up? How do you get operational excellence supporting changes in regulation rather than pure consistent transformation?
It's simple. At least let me take first on the pharma side. When you get into the pharma side, it's something very important that Mark said. It's about how you document your process. How do you measure your process? If you cannot measure your process, you cannot manage it. So the FDA actually expect from you to understand your process from step to step, to make sure that you measure your process, but at the same time, you got very clearly well-defined roles and responsibilities in that process. If you have those kind of four main things into the process, you are in compliance. The problem comes when you have a lot of different processes in place. The standardization is not there. Everybody does stuff in silos. That's when the problem comes. So, but if you make sure that compliance of the process, that you make sure that everybody understands the process very clear, what is your role, and you measure it, you understand that what are the metrics involved with the process, you're fine. You're perfectly fine. It's simple.
And what about your engagement with the regulators? Mark talked there about a meeting with the regulators, and I'm sure Dale has got some examples there as well. Does the operational excellence community meet with the regulators in that industry?
Actually, something, I have never been exposed directly to have a conversation about operational excellence with an FDA auditor. More than anything else, is a part of our business that is embedded. But we have never had that kind of, I cannot tell you that I have been going to an FDA auditor. What do you think about an operational excellence?
I think, David, to also look at it from a regulator standpoint, and I don't want to sound disingenuous, and that's not meant to be the case here. I think they also have a tremendous challenge to roll out this change as well. And I think in other cases, they may not fully know right from the start what it is they're looking to achieve. I think there are definitely examples of where maybe 2 or 3 regulatory bodies almost compete for the same prize. There is definitely some sort of situation where we may have to go and seek clarification to 2 or 3 different bodies to understand what is exactly you want, because you're saying one thing, and certainly if I look at transatlantic, where my bank particularly is governed as much by what goes on in the UK as it goes on in the US. You've got an international dynamic to it as well. So I think in defense of the regulator, absolutely, they have got a challenge to roll this out just as quickly as we have. And I think, dialogue and with them, and I'm fortunate that I get to speak to them quite often, is important, because I think collectively, where they are more involved and more integrated, hence the more on-site exam teams that we now seem to see more often, where we have that, we end up with a better product, with a better answer. And I've got colleagues in other banks who are struggling because their relationship with the regulator is not a particularly productive one. It's viewed more as a threat, as an enemy, rather than say, somebody can partner with you to get to the same. Ultimately, we're all there to get to the same end, which is a stronger, secure, better, more efficient, more transparent banking industry. We all want that. It's just, how do we partner to get there?
Dale, anything that you would say on that? I think that's something in your industry that's quite strong, isn't it? Or am I wrong there?
Yeah, I think the common sense approach is simply that if you're going to try and take on your USDA or FDA inspector in the food industry, I can assure you you're not going to win. So the wisest thing to do is A, have a strong relationship with them, and B, follow the procedures that's laid down. Because literally, when followed, they tend to work with us. They're not coming in to slow us down. They're really holding us to a very, very high standard in food safety. And that compliance for us becomes our gold standard. So we could actually have slightly less standards to be FDA or local city than we are at USDA, but we decide to invest the additional dollars to make sure that our sanitation, our people flow, education, pathogenic testing, all the work we have to do, we do it for all of our meals. We don't say USDA is one cost and the rest of the business is a different fee. And by raising the bar to the highest standard of whoever is auditing you is the smartest way to go forward. And don't look at it as a cost, as Angel mentioned as well. Don't look at it as a cost of doing business. Look at it as the foundations and fundamentals of running a business, especially in the food business, where your brand is destroyed if you have a food poisoning outbreak or any such recalls, etc. So that's the way I tend to look at it. I'd rather work with them than debate with them.
Yeah, David, you and I were talking in the green room about the FCA. Talk us through your experiences there, because you've spoken to regulators in the UK about these challenges.
Yeah, briefly, a long time ago when it was still the FSA. Again, if I kind of use that to present my position on some of these things, and then perhaps I can find a question out of that to present to the guys on the panel. I was asked to go in and advise on culture and define culture and culture change, because I think everybody would probably agree that if you say to somebody define culture, you'd get a different definition every time, and it needs a lot more rigor than just saying the way we do things around here. So I got into some quite deep conversations over a couple of different meetings with the guys at the FSA, as it was then, and got into the area of having to philosophically define what we believe to be good, bad, right or wrong, before you can understand what the purpose is, before you can set policy, which puts boundaries on what people are allowed to do and are not allowed to do, before you can even get anywhere near the process improvement aspect and get alignment between all those things for operational excellence or lean. And when I pointed out that the whole principle of to regulate is to be to control, and that psychologically controlling people links to a condition called learned helplessness, and we ultimately end up shutting people down when we put them in a fear-based punitive environment, the conversation had to end, because they couldn't see a way forward in terms of taking away the fact that there has to be punishment and fear used to control to be a regulator. So that's one aspect where we are, basing our fundamental assumptions about what works and what doesn't work for human beings in a work environment on something that actually counteracts and undermines that. Secondly, I was exposed to, I won't mention any names, but let's say a regulated service provider, And the issue of, it's a phrase I've used, I don't know if it's common elsewhere, but target-driven behaviours. When you put a target in place, and usually when it's financial, people are driven to act in ways that are not of benefit to the outcome requirements of the organisation, but line their own pockets. And there can be, regulators quite happily put in place a 12-stage scoring system for executives to get a huge payout. And those execs will make decisions, as I've seen, that make sure they get their 4 times gearing ratio on their bonus, rather than actually doing what's required to deliver the service. So there's quite a few issues there that at a deeper cultural level, I think we perhaps need to address. And I just wonder, do the guys see process as something that is aligned to the ultimate purpose of the regulators you're dealing with? Because I see quite a massive disconnect in most organisations and industries, that the drive to be in control or the drive to make profit isn't necessarily the right thing in terms of the drive to get the operations as excellent as they possibly can be. As Angel said, it's putting the patient first is a good ultimate intent and purpose. But if the regulator has gone forward with their control mechanism designed on the assumption that they want to get cost out, then you've got conflicting purpose. And as soon as you're there, you're talking about the beliefs that people hold and the conflict between people at very senior levels setting policy, which can just make it confusing for everybody else. So I don't know if that actually is enough of a question, or you can help me frame it as a question better than that. But I mean, do you see these things as well, guys? Do you see that conflict at the higher levels? And does it affect the operational excellence application?
Maybe this is Dale, just to step in for a second. Every operation that I have has a head of operational excellence. Every business I've ever managed also has it. And we're not implementing change and lean principles to meet compliance. It's not what we do. It's a given, just as we also look at ergonomics and making sure that we've not got workplace injuries and taking care of our employees. We're literally coming in to make our meals to the right standard safely, but also by investing in the people and making sure that the morale is right. If we can keep the morale high with our employees who are working in the cold, in a chilled environment, which is quite tricky to do that, but we do a lot of work in boosting that morale so that they don't see compliance as painful or we have to do it. It's just the basic foundation for us as we do it. The second part is I also hold people like myself accountable as the CEO of the company. I don't manage my business from the office. So 70% of my time is in the manufacturing plants. It's working with my team. So when they do Kaizens and change events, I literally have my sleeves rolled up beside them. There's a number of people on this call that's worked with me over the years and know that I could be a little bit too much in their detail. But the reason is, if you do this from the office and dictate into the business that we must follow compliance or we've got to get an ROI, it's just totally the wrong approach. So from the bottom up, invest in great people, invest in great subject matter leaders, and then at the top, remove the barriers for those individuals to be successful, then compliance is only a fundamental. And that's my simple view on it.
Angel, any view from you there?
Yeah, it's very interesting because in our industry, like Dale said, the patient comes first, but there is always that conflict between what am I supposed to do? Am I supposed to be the cost out, or at the same time the compliance? With the years, we have learned, and it's not easy, that if you actually get to manage your process in a certain way that you understand it and that you can measure and you can tweak it, the money will come. You have to be patient. That's the problem. When you said that problem with the executive level, and then when we're pushing down to our management, we have to have a very clear understanding. In one of the organizations that I have managed, is very interesting. Operational excellence is a combination of 3 departments. It's very interesting. Continuous improvement, technology, and engineering. So They said, if we can complement those three departments on looking for solutions with new technology, and you put the process improvement of the CI together, you had a great solution in place. And many of the organizations outside, they keep them separate. You know, you never see that engineering department working together with the CI, or don't see the CI working with the technology team. But when you put them together and you make sure that you use technology to actually apply it to process improvement, hey, it goes great, because you get your compliance, you get better processes, and you get your money out and the cost out. Because I'm not cutting heads. I'm actually getting better capacity. I'm producing more with less. And that's another part, you know, revenue generation. You know, sometimes business, they only think about cost out, and they don't think about that extra revenue generation that you can get combining those trees. And it's important. It's super important.
Mark, Mark, I want to bring you in on the comment that David made, because I think that's very relevant in the banking industry, right? And particularly when we look at what the media portray about the industry. And we look at 2008 and what happened around the world for a lot of people. That driver towards targeting people on trying to leverage their bonus or whatever that might be, versus being compliant and thinking about the patient safety element of the industry. What would you say about that, and maybe some experiences maybe as an insider?
Well, I can certainly give you my personal experience on remuneration for sure. Yeah, it's a very interesting question, and I'll try and frame it in a couple of ways, or answer in a couple of ways. One, there are certain parts of banking where, you know, they are incentivized and people are asked to behave in a certain way, because that's how we are measuring them in short term, generating profits, generating revenue streams and whatever. There are other parts of banking which are less dynamic, and I'm thinking maybe more retail banking, certainly more transactional banking, more commercial banking, where there's less pressure. You know, performance can be measured over a period of years as opposed to a period of quarters. So certainly, you know, I'm very familiar with the investment bank, and I have been for the last 5 or 6 years. There is definitely, you know, behavior, rightly or wrongly, around trying to get the maximum out of a process. And if I look at what typically people have done in the past, we have arbitrarily cut headcounts with not much sense behind it. We have deployed people or roles to cheaper locations because that gives us a quick short-term benefit. And if we don't integrate those processes quickly into something more substantial, yeah, the returns are, but it's not meant, people are not viewing it longer term, they're viewing it, what can I do this quarter, what can I do this year to give me an extra 10%? And I think we've run out of options. And if I look at my portfolio today and what's being asked of me, most of it is, how can I get capacity back into my process? How can I give people a bit of a break? Because we've gone too far on the cost side, we've gone too far with the traditional tools of cost management, and we need to come back in there. And I think, whether we like it or not, the compliance, and to the theme of the conversation, the regulatory challenge is adding cost back into what we do. So we've got this dynamic of, we've taken all the cost out, we've now got to bring cost back into the process if we do it in a traditional old-fashioned way. What can we as a change community do to not only give people capacity to embrace that additional non-value add, but at the same time keep stakeholders very happy that we can show something quite quickly? And I'm not too sure, David, to your question, you know, if we've really cracked that particular piece. If I look at where I've been more successful and felt good about what I've done personally, it tends to be more in the retail, transactional, commercial banking arena than in the investment bank, where they typically go back to, you know, short, painful lessons in order to get that profit, despite, you know, the drive to take on more regulatory change. So it's a great question, and one I don't think we've come to grips with in certain parts of banking for sure.
No, I mean, my question's premised on the fact that this was in the days of TCF and treating customers fairly. And yeah, what I was hearing loud and clear is that people were being coerced into following the rules that were compliant with the ideal of treating customers fairly, because they had to, because there would be a fine of, you know, in the order of millions of pounds for the bank if they didn't. rather than looking at it in terms of an evolved cultural approach and people taking responsibility on the front line to treat customers fairly through choice. And that's a very different culture that you create, and it comes from the imposition of fines and fear. And you said people was, I think I dropped out right at the very beginning. I had to scrabble to get back into the call, but I just caught you saying that you're dealing with a workforce who are scared and tired. And I think there's a huge impact on the way we can or can't function when we're in fear of the repercussions of an action. And it's very different from when we can feel confident. I mean, every market trades on confidence, doesn't it? You know, especially money markets, and every part of manufacturing and engineering that spins off of that. And if we're creating conditions in which our employees can't be confident in taking an action and making a decision because there's that fear hanging over their heads of punishment, then that's the culture that we will end up with. And I think that's the dilemma.
I know, absolutely. And you know, that fear translates itself into so many controls and measures and reviews and anything that begins with RE seems to come back into my life these days. You know, but that fear is making people less confident to do the right thing quickly. You know, they're looking for 3 or 4 levels of approval or 3 or 4 levels of oversight before they allow that thing to move on. And you know, that in itself, and therefore I think where we can add value is to almost go back in. And if I look at, again, some of the tools that we've been using, you know, I've almost gone back to what I learned 10, 12, 15 years ago in terms of the things that seem to matter today, which is simply basic, you know, map and measuring, you know, basic, what are my controls? How do I, you know, error-proof those? How do I make sure that we just do it once before we move on? And it's not trying to remove things now, it's almost trying to simplify what we do before we can then start to look at removing and adding value by taking cost out. It's almost, how do I just make this process a little bit quicker? How do I get 5%, not that 15, 20%, which we were looking for maybe, you know, several years ago? And it's interesting, I've gone back to some of that basic stuff that seems to resonate more than some of the big Gucci stuff that we all typically enjoy.
I think I wanted to pose a question to Dale and Angel, because if I think about the banking industry, the regulation that comes down on that industry more recently as being more significant, more consistently thorough, and you know, CFOs are going to jail in banks, and CEOs are on the hook for regulatory change within organizations. Dale and Angel, what would you say that industry and other industries that are becoming more and more regulated now could learn from maybe some of the industries that are more consistently regulated, like the food industry or like the medical device and pharma industry, as it relates to operational excellence? What do you think that those industries could learn if you were to go and sit in front of a chief risk officer or a CFO of a bank or an insurance company?
I think maybe, Angel, if I go first, if you don't mind.
Right.
I'd also like to go back very quickly to one of Angel's comments. I thought his answer was excellent on the 3 fundamental streams. I would add a 4th, which I think is very useful, which is what we literally call PE, product engineering, and making sure that the design team that is sitting at headquarters is designing for complexity. So when we design, in ours, we design meals, we have to make sure that it isn't so complex that it can't be replicated in high volumes that create some of the challenges that they face at the operational level. So we do a lot of work also before continuous improvement on the design phase and linking that and scaling that into our manufacturing. So it becomes a very critical foundation also as a 4th stream to Angel's 3 that he mentioned. And then coming back to the compliance side, I think the simple answer is there is no shortcuts to compliance. There just isn't. And there is a cost associated, but you know, myself and our CEO, David, the 2 of us together, we simply say it is a cost of sleeping well at night. And that's what it is. So there are multiple areas where I can focus without looking at taking shortcuts in compliance. And I often find that when we start lean journeys and operational excellence journeys, we focus on labor. So take my business in manufacturing, we would say the back of house in our central production units, let's make these people more productive. Yet it is 14% of my total cost, and 55% of my total cost is material. cost of goods. So let's get a 5-point improvement in cost of goods versus making my people work harder. And it's the old saying that when I started my lean journey many years ago, I would always hear from the employees that said, we used to tell them they're going to work smarter, not harder. And it's not often the case. So my point is, don't put pressure on the individuals. Don't create such complexity that they have to take shortcuts. And from shortcuts, you will then start to have effects in compliance. But again, it is part of life. Follow it. And again, my final guidance would be raise the bar to the highest standards you can and manufacture that way. And that just, it makes me, when I go home, sleep at night knowing that my operations are running to the highest standard. Angel, I'm sorry if I interrupted you.
No, and I completely agree with you. In the medical environment, it's about how can you sleep at night. It's basically as that. You know, we always tell our employees is, think about that the product that you are actually making is going to go to your wife, to your kids, to your mom, to your dad. Do you want to feel safe that you're giving them something that is going to make them better or is going to hurt them? You know, so that part of the compliance is in our mind. You know, we need to follow a process and we need to follow some rules on the compliance, not because we said so. It's those rules are made and they're put in the process to make sure that the process works and we do not hurt anybody. And the word over here is consistent. And I'm going to take you to that word that is very important, be consistent, because if you think about it, the word of Lean Six Sigma is about how do you work on the variation of the process and how do you work on the cycle time with the lean tools. Well, you know what? It's the same thing over here. If we do not actually are consistent in our creation of a process that deliberately all the time what we're expecting safely to our patient, then David, we fail. We fail. And the worst part that you can have, Dale said it, you don't want to have a recall in one process, in one product, and then you start hurting people because you're going to say, how am I going to be able to sleep at night? And that's the part. I'll be honest with you. When I used to be in the media broadcasting industry, I used to sleep like a baby. And my only problem was to see, am I going to be working with J-Lo or am I going to be working with Mark Anthony? That was the only problem. And the medical devices are a different environment.
Sounds like, why did you leave that job? That sounds like the perfect job.
Hey, J-Lo is a very difficult woman.
Try changing that, right? You talk. I asked the question about advice. You know, in other industries, guys, you know, you talk there about being able to sleep at night, and I think, you know, some of these industries perhaps aren't life or death. You know, so if you put a product into a human that is faulty, you may cause that person to die. Similarly with the food industry, right? Food poisoning and dealing with that industry. But there are other industries that aren't so, the damage isn't as significant to health, but also there's financial aspects. And I think about service providers, and I think about the other industries like banking and similar industries that are in the same, the energy sector, et cetera, et cetera. When we think about advice for those industries, Angel, what would you say, you know, as one piece?
I'll make it easier for you, David. When I create the first program of operational excellence in media broadcasting in Univision, the first thing that you ask your employees and your team is, how do you define success? You know, what it means for you to be successful. The answer that I get from everybody, all the way from operators, all the way to executive level, was that the TV is not going to be dark. So while there's something on that TV, we're successful. That's crazy. That's, you know, that's not a way to measure success, because what happens if what you put on the TV is not working? It's a piece of crap that is not good for the people to watch it. People are not watching it. But they told me, you know, the worst thing that can happen in my industry, in the medical, is that somebody get hurt. In their industry is that the TV go dark. So we change that mentality. You know, we start working with the editors, with the executive producers. Stop, guys. You know, if you're making a show, How many packages do you need? How long is it taking you? What are you putting in the air? What is the value? Are we actually getting different platforms that we're doing? So it's like, it was kind of like a get them in out of the robot mentality. I'm doing this because they told me to do it. And now I'm doing this. Oh, hold on. I'm doing this. Why am I doing this? You know, and that's the part that we started 4 years ago in that industry. And we changed it to the point that now they understand, okay, making TV costs X amount of money. It takes X amount of hours of people working. And by the way, we can be more effective and better on what we put on the air if we think and we measure what we're doing. So it works the same, but yeah, you know, it depends. How do you measure success? Tell me.
Yeah, good. I want to come on to a question. Go on, sorry.
Just to, you're asking about advice.
Yeah.
I think part of the advice I'd give to the group and to others listening in is make sure that compliance, the governance of your business, is discussed at the right level with the right amount of time. It's generally discussed when it becomes a problem, not when you can be proactive and solve the issue by giving yourself the time, the senior leadership, the right levels of authority in the business. My head of food safety in every operation knows, and they have the full autonomy, that the meals do not go out the door if there's something not right. They stop it. And that they pull rank on the vice presidents, they pull rank on everyone right up to myself, because they know that they have to have that governance that says, yes, we want to get the meals to the customer, but if they're not right, they don't go out the door. And if I can give a 2-second story, when I was in the airline industry at Continental Airlines, one of the cardinal sins you must never do is damage an aircraft. And the catering trucks come up to the aircraft. It's a very dangerous environment. There's a lot of training. But I remember a young gentleman hit one of our aircrafts with his truck, and he needed a guide man to guide him onto the aircraft. And there wasn't a guide man, and he broke the rules by maneuvering without a guide man, and he damaged the fuselage of the aircraft. He was to be dismissed, and at his hearing, he said, I couldn't find anybody to help me, so I moved and I was wrong. But when I damaged the aircraft, there were 12 people came from all different departments, safety, cameras, to do the investigation. If one of them was just available when I needed them, I wouldn't have damaged the aircraft. So the reason I tell the story is to say, make sure that the resources are focused at the front of the business, not when you have the issue, and spend the adequate time at the senior leadership.
Mark, give us a financial services view from your experience on that.
I agreed, and I think if I look at what we've been doing in the last 8-10 years, sadly we tend to be trying to clear up a problem rather than proactively address a change. However, if I look at 2 of the 3 largest compliance projects or regulatory projects in the bank today, 2 of them have the regulators as part of steering committees, as part of working groups. You know, we've adopted personas around regulators. We try to understand what it is they would want from a process at the start before we then start to build that. So I think we've spent several years trying to clean up. And if you look at the headline cases today, these are problems that occurred, 8, 9, 10 years ago in some cases, particularly on the training side of life. So I think we have learnt the pain of trying to retrospectively clean up a problem. And I think to Dale's point, we are bringing in, maybe because they're on site and they're visible, maybe because we've got better partnerships, but we're getting their input at the start. We're understanding what it is they would want out of a process. I mentioned right at the start of the hour, 4 or 5 things they look for constantly. And we're now building that into certainly the change projects that I'm seeing. Could it be better? Of course. But at the end of the day, we have got better dialogue, and it is starting to happen at the start rather than at the end.
And from a leadership perspective, as we think about the subject title of the challenges driving operational excellence in a regulated industry, one of the things that always comes up when I talk to clients and candidates alike is where the buy-in is for a program of this nature within an organization for it to maximize its potential. In your opinions and in your experience, where should operational excellence sit within the C-suite? And when we think about regulatory, does it sit in the risk environment? Does it sit in the CFO? Who's ultimately accountable? Dale was using accountability as a prime example when he's talking about food safety. Who is the accountable person in that organization as it relates to, regulatory or regulated industries and driving OPEX?
Go ahead. You go first, Dale, please.
Yeah, typically we have it sitting at the CEO level. So Dave Kirchhoff, our CEO, has it sitting literally on his senior leadership team. It is that important to us that they have the power to be represented at the top of the industry and be able to make sure that they have the power going through the whole business. So as a topic, it is something that gets a lot of focus. We literally will probably spend 10 minutes of our 90-minute weekly meeting talking about compliance. How can we actually make sure that our efficiency through following compliance can be met? And our head of food safety and compliance is an excellent individual, but he's also skilled in working with the employees. So we try to get away from the fear factor of here comes compliance to actually working very closely with them in the operation, supporting leadership, supporting the employees. But it literally sits at the senior level of the organization.
Great.
I would agree. I think it's something that has to sit across the executive team, really. If you're going to get true alignment, there has to be the capacity for everybody to be sharing the common vision for the business and where it's going, the common purpose. And if that purpose includes getting the operations to be excellent and removing cost and improving quality, cost delivery, growth, safety, morale, the old acronym that comes from pre-lean days when it was still called world-class manufacturing. Those are the key things. If that's something that's got to filter throughout the business, it really has to be a strong belief system within the executive, and they have to share that common view, because if they don't, they will do things that conflict with one another. And again, it goes back to that issue of, have you got a conflict between the executive team and the regulator? I was chatting to a guy the other day that was a first-tier supplier for IT solutions to a well-known children's hospital. And he said the problem is there's 5 people in the same management roles and none of them will make a decision because they're all too scared of getting it wrong. So nothing's moving forward. There's no continuous improvement, and yet they're being compliant, but their costs are through the roof and their efficiency is ridiculous. And then we worry about NHS budgets. So there's so many ways that we can suffer from this target-driven behaviours issue that I mentioned earlier. When we set targets, we think they're good, but with a narrow view of what good looks like, we can quite often drive behaviours in defence of our own position, or in other people that are defending their own position, that don't actually contribute to the outcome requirements. And it's very easy to get this conflict of interests throughout large organisations and small organisations, just because we don't think the top level stuff through adequately, and we don't get that alignment in the executive teams. Yeah, good. Angel, what about you? Where does it sit for you?
In our organization, it goes all the way from the CEO down. We do have an organization that the only thing that they do is manage that is what we call the RQC, regulatory quality and compliance. But it doesn't matter that they are kind of like the leaders, but it breathes everywhere. Operations, finance, HR, and EHS are very critical parts in the business that they go through that. So I cannot tell you that it's something that just lay down in one place. It's actually that we live at it. And by the way, we have to be in compliance in order to be in business. So everybody knows that. So we have it very clear. Yeah, good. Mark, what about you to close that question off from a leadership perspective?
I think, it's the good news. If I look at my current employer, if I look at where I was previously, it's absolutely taken as being an incredibly serious requirement. So it sits within the CEO, COO function. They haven't distributed, the RACI across several business lines in terms of ownership. They've made sure that it sits with one very, very senior individual. And in my case, it sits within the COO function. Clearly, everyone has a part to play, but there's absolute clarity around the seriousness of these changes and who and at what level it has to be driven at. So I think the governance piece within certainly the bank I'm in at the moment, it is spot on. It's appropriate for what we need to do. We haven't repeated, or we haven't looked at where we've done things in the past and put it in different pockets, hoping that collectively it'll work. It is strong and it's appropriate leadership in this case.
Great. We're coming up to the hour here. We've got about 5 minutes left. I want to pose one or two questions that we talked about before we came on to the webinar, gents. How does regulatory activity affect scalability, and how do you retain skill and excellence as well? And I think, Mark, I want to come back to a point that you raised at the start around people are tired around it. But so, if we think about that, what would you say there? How does regulatory activity affect scalability in the industry that you're in, but also how do you retain the skill and the excellence as well?
My gut reaction to a very good question is that I think it's had a significant impact in a poor way. In terms of what we like to do. I think what we've done with the way that we've looked at compliance and regulatory change, or regulatory requirements in the past, is very much been simply to throw it onto a process and hopefully it works. What we have seen, and again, I'm only going to go by my last 6 months of engagement, is a lot more interest on getting some short-term capacity to embrace that change. So some of the things we've been working on here in Barclays in the operations space is some very targeted 10, 12-week programs to give us 10%. We're not asking for the world, we're not asking for a huge amount of capacity, we're asking for 2 hours a week for a certain process, or maybe 3 or 4 hours for a certain individual over a month, to be able to comply with this, what we consider to be non-value add. So I think we're having to not necessarily look at supporting the regulatory change that's being done by different groups in different ways. What we're being asked to do is create capacity to embrace or absorb that change. And I'm seeing that if we can focus on building some capacity, if we can bring some quick wins in that space, we're getting a better chance at securing and having the regulatory impact being less onerous to us going forward. So it is difficult, because if we don't do it clever, in a smart, clever way, it will do, and it will address exactly what you just described in your question. It will start to sink us again. So yeah, short-term capacity gains, quick wins, 5–10% here or there, is all that they're asking for. They're not asking for a lot, and we have to deliver on that, and we have to tailor our solutions to give that in a relatively quick way. And I think, if you look at some of the 5 lenses approaches that are out there, and other words that we use for that, we can deliver that, and we just need to make sure that we do deliver on that change.
Great. Dale, any view from you there?
Yeah, I mentioned at the very early stages that we like to recruit the best and recruit real subject matter experts who are then allowed to do their job. Let's not micromanage them. I tend to make sure that they understand what the scope is, what our strategy is, and our vision, and then allow them to go and do their job. That's kind of number one, certainly at the executive level and senior management level. And then for me, when we get to the employee level who are working in the manufacturing phase, it's also making sure that we keep them motivated and work with them through a lean process to take on volume and capacity. So we find we have a culture of Kaizens and lean manufacturing, as I said, and under ops excellence. We're generally seeing from each Kaizen about between 10 and 15% productivity improvement. We generally see about 20% floor space gain. We tend to see reduction in surplus and waste in material control. So we replicate that Kaizen event to bring in capacity into the business. And at the same time, whenever we go through what we would have in our business as a menu change, all of the design team, all the senior management literally spend 5 days with the team, where we're hairnets on, we're safety shoes, and we're white lab coats, and actually work with them. We call it walk a mile in my shoes, so they actually understand what they have to do. And it goes back to that complexity side of working with your team. So a real strong lean leader, making sure we follow Kaizen to deal with scaling capacity, and at the same time allow your subject matter experts to do their job.
Good. Yeah. Angel, anything you would say there in terms of that question?
Yeah, the only thing that I would add is that we focus a lot in adding capability to our people, meaning what are the set of tools that you need to do your job the right way. And we actually keep tabs on that and make sure that we understand what do they need, and we keep adding those skill set. And we have noticed that the more that you provide that capability and that knowledge into the process, the better they perform and more compliant they are.
Good. Good. David, final comments from you there on that. What would you say in terms of that question around scalability, your regulatory activity affecting that?
Yeah, I've lost connection for as you pose the question, so I'm not sure I can answer the exact question.
Let me cover it again. How does regulatory activity affect scalability, and how do you retain skills and excellence as well?
Wow. I think it's repressive. It is the honest answer. Just largely going back to my first statement, that you create a culture that's based on sort of punitive outcomes and fear. And if you're going to create a prevailing backdrop to any kind of organisation and performance like that, then you're not going to get the best out of people. And again, attracting the right people, retaining the right people, and making it more sustainable, I would say, you know where I come from on all this stuff in the psychology and neuroscience. There's still a huge gap in the market in terms of understanding how people function and work. We could talk about Noyer's 4-drive theory to learn, bond, defend, and acquire. We could talk about the dopaminergic mesolimbic pathway and how you set goals so that you get the right dopamine release in the brain. If we knew more about that in the industry, and especially if regulators knew more about these things, they could do a much better job of setting policy which would align to getting the outcome requirements that they want, rather than setting policy that's based on fear and undermines their own outcome requirements. So I'm not sure if that answers the question, but that's the first thing that pops to mind.
I think everyone's now Googling those comments you made. Maybe you can put those on the chat.
Half hour to even scratch the surface.
Listen, I want to just cover off a few things that we talked about, and then we'll finish up. I think right at the start, Mark talked about working with regulators, and I think that's been echoed by Dale and also Angel in their career, although Angel maybe not so much in that industry, but I'm sure it does happen. You've got to work with the regulator if you're going to get success, and Mark talked about some examples where they've engaged with stakeholders who are regulators. I think the key stakeholders in the organisation is key as well. Dale talked about accountability, and it goes all the way up to the CEO in terms of regulatory and driving operational excellence in that environment. I think consistency, control, and repetitive behaviour is a key part of what operational excellence can deliver for an organisation. So I think if the two organisations or the two departments of compliance and regulatory and operational excellence work well together, Dale's example of the food safety guy who has complete autonomy and control over what happens in his organisation, and if there's an issue, I think that's where you start to see some of these challenges be accomplished when it relates to OPEX and in a regulated industry. All industries are regulated. Someone said to me the other day, whether you're on the soft side or the very hard side, as Mark made a point right at the start, they've gone from watchdog to bloodhound, and I think that's the relationship piece, and that's the psychology of it that you were talking about, David. So I think that ties in very nicely. Listen, I want to thank everyone for coming on. We had some technical issues halfway through. I hope that that didn't affect too many people watching. Thank you, Angel, for joining, and appreciate your time. And I know you were rushing to get to us today, and we appreciate you joining us last minute. And thank you so much for your contribution. Dale, I really appreciate your time. Again, thank you for being a part of this. You definitely joined us from the sunniest area in the world, as your backdrop suggests. But thank you so much for joining. David, thanks so much too for your time again, as always, and Mark, really appreciate it. We'll let you get back to your air hockey in the background.
Thank you for that.
I want to thank everyone. Thank everyone for joining as well, and good afternoon, good evening, and good night.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.